The clang of steel echoed through the Springfield armory as John Garand worked in near silence, the hum of his mind louder than any machine. Outside, the air was sharp with the scent of oil and cold iron, a fitting perfume for a man whose dreams were forged in metal. Major Jack Hawk Callahan stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, watching Garand tinker with the slender rifle that so many dismissed as folly. America wanted to cut corners, save pennies, and cling to the bolt-action rifles of the last war, rifles that jammed under mud, that demanded strength over speed. "You really think this thing can win battles?" Callahan's voice carried the tone of disbelief worn by men who'd seen too much. Garand didn't look up. "I think it can save lives." The simplicity of the statement disarmed Hawk more than the weapon itself. Outside, rain drummed the tin roof, like distant gunfire rehearsing for a war not yet begun. The rifle rested on the bench, silent, sleek, and unproven. But there was a strange weight in the air, as though history itself had paused to watch a quiet revolution take shape. The next morning, gray clouds hung low over the proving grounds. Rows of officers in trench coats lined the dirt range, their faces a blend of boredom and superiority. Garand stood apart from them. The prototype, one cradled in his hands like something sacred. Major Callahan was there too, hands shoved deep in his pockets, pretending not to care. But his eyes never left the weapon. When Garand raised the rifle to his shoulder, the chatter around him died. One pull of the trigger, and the sound cracked through the mist like thunder. Then another. Semi-automatic fire, smooth, steady, relentless. Brass castings leapt into the air, gleaming like sparks of revolution. The smell of gunpowder drifted across the field, sharp and defiant. When the rifle's clip ejected with its distinctive metallic ping, silence fell again. Somewhere behind the group, a colonel muttered, "Not bad." For a toy, Garand said nothing. He simply stepped forward, looked downrange, and saw every shot buried center mass. Callahan exhaled a quiet laugh. The kind men make when they're seeing the impossible for the first time. The Army's engineers swarmed the bench afterward, murmuring in disbelief. One inspected the rifle's chamber. Another ran his fingers across the gas system like a priest handling relics. Garand stood silently, listening to their questions blur together. Callahan broke through the crowd, his grin half admiring, half incredulous. "You just made a whole room full of old men nervous," he said. Garand smiled faintly. The kind that didn't need words. Beyond them, the target board told the truth no one could deny. Precision, power, and speed, wrapped in one design. But in the higher offices of Washington, doubt still lingered. Cost, reliability doctrine, excuses dressed as reason. Garand had won a battle of bullets, not mines. He looked back once more at the range, at the steaming rifle still resting on the table, and whispered almost to himself, "It's not about perfection. It's about survival." Back at the armory, as twilight fell through the high windows, Garand worked alone again. Each success only brought more demands, longer range, faster cycling, fewer parts. Callahan stopped by, hat in hand, watching as the inventor adjusted his tools with a surgeon's patience. "They'll never be happy, you know," Callahan muttered. Garand nodded without looking up. "They don't have to be. The soldiers will." The glow of the desk lamp carved long shadows across the floor. Outside, the distant whistle of a train carried the rhythm of industry, a reminder that the world beyond his bench was shifting toward something darker, something inevitable. In the stillness, the rifle gleamed on the table, a promise forged from doubt and sleepless nights. A week later, the War Department called. Production approval was pending. Garand stood on the phone, his knuckles white around the receiver. They said, "WWII, they'll think about it," he murmured, disbelief undercutting his calm voice. Callahan, who had been waiting nearby, frowned. "After what they saw, they should be begging you. But Garand wasn't angry. He understood bureaucracy like he understood recoil, a force that resists progress. Outside, snow had begun to fall over Massachusetts, soft flakes settling on the windowsill. Garand looked out into the gray morning, his reflection faint in the glass. "Let them think," he said quietly. "The war will decide faster than they ever will." And for the first time, Callahan believed him. The testing grounds of Aberdeen Proving Facility stretched under a bleak sky, wind slicing through the Maryland plains like a blade. Rows of rifles lined the tables, each awaiting judgment. Garand stood beside his prototype, calm but taut beneath his composure. The brass had arrived. Officers with polished shoes and colder eyes. They weren't there to celebrate him. They were there to find fault. "Mud test first," one engineer barked. They dunked them on in a trough of sludge, grinding the bolt full of grit. Garand's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The test rifle came up, dripping brown and heavy. He loaded it, aimed, and fired. The first shot cracked through the air clean. Then another. The mechanism cycled perfectly. No jam, no hesitation. Callahan, standing in the back with his coat pulled tight, couldn't hide his grit. The officers scribbled notes, unwilling to meet Garand's eyes. For every bullet that fired, another doubt was erased. That evening, under the stark lights of the barracks workshop, Garand dismantled the rifle piece by piece. His hands moved like a pianist's, fast, deliberate, but trembling from exhaustion. Every test meant another tweak, another sleepless night. Callahan dropped by again, a flask in his hand and worry in his eyes. "They'll break your rifle just to prove a point," he muttered. Garand didn't look up. "Then I'll build it stronger." The sound of metal on metal filled the room, rhythmic and relentless. Callahan watched in silence, understanding for the first time that this wasn't just engineering. It was endurance. The man and the weapon were beginning to share the same soul. Oh! The following day brought the endurance test. 5,000 rounds. No cleaning. No mercy. Garand's rifle sat in the mount like a soldier awaiting execution. The first 100 rounds thundered smoothly. By 2,000, the barrels smoked and the air reeked of burnt powder. By 4,000, the chamber glowed faintly red. The men running the test muttered, half in awe, "Wah, wah." Callahan kept count aloud, his voice hoarse from shouting over the gunfire. When the final round fired without a jam, Garand simply nodded and said, "It's ready." No boasting, no triumph, just quiet finality. The officers watching were left in stunned silence, their skepticism melting under the sound of perfection. Late that night, Garand sat outside the barracks, the world around him quiet, except for the hum of generators. The rifle rested beside him, its metal cool again after the trial. Callahan joined him, cigarette ember glowing in the dark. "You ever think about what happens if they don't approve it?" he asked softly. Garand stared at the horizon. "They will. They just don't know it yet." Callahan chuckled, low and tired. "You're a stubborn man, John." Garand gave a faint smile. "So's this rifle." Above them, the first stars pierced through the cloud cover. Small, persistent, and shining through resistance. A week later, the verdict came down. The M1 was approved for production. The first semi-automatic rifle ever to be standard issue in the U.S. Army. Garand received the news in a short telegram, impersonal and bureaucrat. He read it twice, then simply folded it and slipped it into his pocket. When Callahan arrived with 2 mugs of coffee and found him staring out the window, he asked, "You did it. Why do you look like you lost?" Garand didn't answer right away. "Because now," he said slowly, "men will go to war with what I built." The weight of his creation finally settled on his shoulders. Not pride, not victory, but the sobering understanding that innovation had a heartbeat, and soon it would be tested in blood. The training fields of Fort Benning were alive with the thunder of rifle fire. Dozens of young recruits lined up under the Georgia sun, sweat pouring down their necks as instructors barked commands. Private Eli Torres gripped the new M1 Garand for the first time, feeling its weight settle into his palms like destiny. "No more bolts, boys," Sergeant Frank Dole shouted, pacing before them. "You squeeze, it fires. You squeeze again, it fires again. Welcome to the future." The line erupted in gunfire, sharp, rhythmic, like a mechanical heartbeat echoing across the fields. Torres felt the rifle kick against his shoulder, each shot smoother than the last. He smiled without realizing it. The man beside him cursed in disbelief. For the first time, the rifle didn't feel like a tool. It felt alive. And somewhere, far from the field, John Garand's name began to whisper through the ranks, spoken with the respect soldiers reserve for things that keep them breathing. Torres couldn't stop talking about the rifle that night in the barracks. "You see how fast it cycles? No jams, no bolt to slap back," he said, his voice carrying excitement that almost bordered on reverence. Doc Reeves, sitting on his bunk, cleaning his medical kit, smiled faintly. "You talk about that rifle like it's a girl." Torres grit. "Maybe she is." Laughter rolled through the dim barracks, cutting through the exhaustion that hung over them. Sergeant Dole, sitting near the door, allowed himself a rare smile. "You'll stop smiling when you're firing that thing in the rain," he muttered. But even he couldn't hide his pride. Outside, cicadas hummed against the window screens. The M1 Garand leaned against the wall beside Torres' bunk, its metal gleaming softly in the low light. The beginning of a bond between soldier and steel. Weeks passed. The men grew faster, sharper, deadlier. What had once felt like novelty now felt like instinct. The M1 had become an extension of their will. During a live fire exercise, Dole barked commands while bullets snapped through the morning fog. Torres advanced, reloading mid-stride with fluid precision. "That's it! Torres! Keep moving!" Dole shouted. The metallic ping of an empty clip rang out like a bell of progress. Each man trusted that sound, the rhythm of reload, fire, and move. On the sidelines, Callahan watched silently with other officers, noting the difference, the confidence in their pace, the steadiness in their eyes. This wasn't training anymore. It was evolution. At the mess hall, word spread fast. The Garands going overseas. Orders had come in. Troops were being armed for deployment to Europe. The chatter mixed pride and fear in equal measure. "They say it's the finest rifle ever made," someone murmured. "They say it never quits." Torres sat quietly, his hands around a cup of coffee gone cold. Across the table, Doc Reeves adjusted his glasses. "It's a fine rifle," he said softly, "but rifles don't win wars. Men do." Dole nodded. "Then we better make sure we're ready to be the men who use it right." The room fell quiet. Outside, trucks rumbled in the distance, their engines a promise of what was coming. The transport yard buzzed with controlled chaos. Crates marked U.S. Rifle, Cal 30 MUN were stacked high against the sunrise. Garand himself stood among them, flown down from Massachusetts to see the first shipment leave. Callahan greeted him with a firm handshake. "You did it, John," he said. Garand smiled faintly. "No," he replied. "They'll do it now." He gestured toward the soldiers loading crates, the young men who would soon carry his invention into the unknown. Torres caught sight of them and saluted without knowing who the quiet man in the gray coat was. Garand returned the salute, a silent exchange between creator and bearer. The roar of engines filled the yard as the first truck rolled out, the name Garand painted small but proud on every crate. History was on the move. Dawn broke over the gray waves of the English Channel, and the sea reeked of salt, oil, and dread. Packed shoulder to shoulder in landing craft, the men waited for the ramp to drop. Private Eli Torres clutched his M1 Garand, his fingers trembling not from cold, but from the knowledge that this was no longer training. Sergeant Frank Dole stood beside him, silent, eyes locked on the churning water ahead. The engines roared. "Remember your drills!" Dole shouted over the noise. "Keep that rifle dry." When the ramp slammed down, the world erupted. Machine gun tracers tore the surf into chaos. Torres dove into the freezing water, the weight of the rifle dragging him momentarily under before he fought back to the surface. Around him, men screamed, bullets hissed, and history began its blood-soaked march onto Normandy's shores. The beach was madness, sand and blood blending under relentless fire. Torres crawled forward, every movement fueled by survival. Beside him, Doc Reeves dragged a wounded man through the surf, shouting for cover. Dole's voice cut through the chaos like a whip, rallying whoever could still hear him. Up the dunes. Move! The M1 barked in Torres' hands. Smooth, powerful, and steady even in terror's grip. Each shot answered an enemy, muzzle flash. Somewhere behind the smoke, Callahan watched from a command post, his binoculars shaking slightly as he whispered, "So this is what it was built for." The rifle that had begun in silence now thundered across a continent. By midday, the dunes were theirs. The survivors huddled behind broken walls and burning trucks, the air thick with the smell of cordite and death. Torres sat against a mound of sandbags, staring at his rifle, its barrel blackened but flawless. "You good?" Dole asked, dropping beside him. Torres nodded faintly. "She didn't jam once." Dole looked at him, then at the weapon, and gave a low whistle. Guess the old man was right. Nearby, Doc Reeves worked silently over the wounded, hands red to the wrists. Callahan approached, kneeling beside Dole. "Hold this ground," he said quietly. "More waves coming." The men nodded. They didn't need speeches. They had the sound of the M1 ping echoing across the beach, the sound of endurance. That night, the rain came. The men sat in flooded foxholes, water up to their ankles, steam rising from the barrels of their rifles after a long day of fighting. Torres leaned against the trench wall, shivering. Dole offered him a cigarette, his hand trembling only slightly. "Hell of a first day," he said. Torres managed a weak grin. They didn't teach this part in Georgia. Above them, the thunder rolled like artillery. Reeves muttered a prayer under his breath, and Callahan passed quietly along the line, checking every foxhole. In the flicker of lightning, the rifles glinted, each one identical, each one personal. The M1 was no longer a weapon. It was a companion in survival. By the next morning, the enemy counterattacked. The air was alive with chaos again, mortars shrieking, dirt exploding in every direction. Torres fired until his shoulder ached, reloading with fluid precision. Dole shouted for ammo. Reeves dragged another man to safety. Callahan called in coordinates over the radio, his voice calm in the storm. "Hold your fire until they're close," he ordered. The moans roared as one. The enemy wave broke against them, the rifle's rhythm steady and unyielding. When the smoke cleared, the ground was littered with silence. Torres looked around at the men who'd survived, fewer than before, but still standing. Dole placed a muddy hand on his shoulder. "That rifle of yours," he said hoarsely, "just saved a lot of us." Torres looked down at it, rain washing the grime from its stock, and whispered, "No, we saved each other." The sun rose like fire over Saipan, turning the sea into molten gold and the air into a furnace. The men had been aboard landing craft again, this time heavier, wearier, and far less naive. Private Eli Torres wiped sweat from his eyes as the shoreline loomed, palm trees, black sand, and smoke rising beyond. Sergeant Frank Dole stood up front, silent and grim. "This isn't Europe," he muttered. "This is hell in daylight." When the craft ground against the beach, they charged forward. The enemy's fire came instantly, cracking through the humid air. Torres hit the ground, sand spraying his face, his rifle already firing. Steam rose from the barrel in the tropical heat. Behind him, Doc Reeves shouted for a medic, and Callahan's voice over the radio urged, "Push inland! The M1 didn't falter. Neither did they." The jungle swallowed sound. The men moved cautiously through the dense canopy, their uniforms soaked, their nerves raw. Every vine looked like a trap, every rustle a threat. Torres led point, his M1 steady despite the humidity clinging to its metal. Dole signaled for silence, crouching low. Suddenly, movement, shadows slipping between the trees. Gunfire erupted. The squad hit the dirt, answering with bursts from their Garands. Leaves shredded, trunks splintered, and screams pierced the thick air. When it was over, the silence returned, heavier than before. Torres exhaled, checking his rifle. Still clean, still firing. He looked to Dole, who nodded once. The weapon was holding up better than the men. Night brought no peace. The jungle was alive with whispers and distant gunfire. Torres sat awake, back against a tree, eyes darting between shadows. His M1 rested across his knees, glistening faintly in the moonlight. "Can't sleep," Doc Reeves whispered. Torres shook his head. "Feels like the whole island's breathing." Reeves gave a faint smile. "Then let it breathe. We'll keep ours steady." Nearby, Dole sat cleaning his rifle with a rag, movements slow and methodical. Callahan's voice came quietly through the radio. Orders for the next push. The men said nothing more. The silence between them was enough. The kind forged only by fire, fear, and faith in cold steel. At dawn, they reached a ridge overlooking a fortified Japanese position. Mortars thudded in the distance, and Callahan's orders came crisp. "We take it fast, before they dig in deeper." Dole adjusted his helmet, looking at his men. "We go loud," he said. The charge erupted through smoke and dust. Torres fired on the move, each shot from his Garand kicking clean and sure. Reeves darted between cover, dragging the wounded back, while Callahan coordinated artillery from the slope. The air turned into a storm of heat, lead, and screams. Torres reached the crest, dropped behind a rock, reloaded, and shouted, "Clear left!" The words were half a prayer, half command. When the last shot faded, the ridge was theirs. The M1 was still hot in his hands, burning, but alive. By evening, the ridge was quiet again. The jungle burned below, 1,000 tiny fires crackling in the humid dusk. Torres sat beside Dole, both men silent, both staring into the orange glow. Reeves tended to his bandaged arm nearby, and Callahan stood overlooking the valley with binoculars. "We held," Callahan said softly. "At what cost?" Dole replied. The only answer was the sound of distant gunfire fading with the sunset. Torres lifted his rifle, checked it again. Smooth, flawless, scarred like them. "She never quit," he murmured. Dole nodded, exhaustion heavy in his eyes. "Neither did you." In the dying light, the M1 gleamed like tempered resolve. A weapon forged not just for war, but for endurance of the human spirit. The war had stretched into every horizon. Europe's frost-bitten forests, the jungles of the Pacific, the deserts of Africa. Yet in every place one sound connected them all. The metallic ping of the M1 Garand's clip ejecting into the air. For Private Eli Torres, now hardened by battles from Normandy to Saipan, that sound was more than machinery. It was the rhythm of survival. On a cold morning in Belgium, he stood shoulder to shoulder with Dole and Reeves, their breath turning to fog. "Same rifle. Different hell," Dole muttered, rubbing his hands. Torres smiled faint. "She hasn't failed us yet." Callahan walked past the line, nodding at their readiness. In the distance, artillery began again. The old, familiar song of a world still tearing itself apart. But through it all, the rifle sang back, steady, defiant, and proud. Rumors spread fast across the ranks. German troops feared the moan's sound, the Americans pinging thunder. In foxholes, men traded stories of the rifle that never quit, that seemed to breathe when its wielder could not. Torres sat cleaning his Garand with care, each movement tender, reverent. "You ever think she'll end up in a museum one day?" Reeves asked quietly. Torres smiled. "Maybe, but not before she gets us home." Dole chuckled low, rolling his shoulders. "If she makes it that far, they ought to give her medals." The men laughed softly, but their eyes stayed tired. Outside, snow fell heavier, covering helmets, rifles, and footprints, as if the world itself was trying to bury the noise of war. As the war dragged on, the M1 became more than a weapon. It was reputation, reassurance, and rumor. Entire companies swore by it. Commanders credited it. Enemies cursed it. In a makeshift camp, Callahan gathered his men for a briefing. Maps spread out on the hood of a jeep. He pointed at enemy positions. "They're dug in deep," he said, "but we move fast. Trust your rifles. They'll carry you through." Torres caught Dole's eye, and for a moment both men felt something unspoken. The rifle wasn't just carrying them. It was a reminder of the man who built it somewhere far away, never knowing how much of himself was in their hand. Across the Pacific, word of the rifle spread just the same. Marines spoke of how it cut through jungle ambushes like a lifeline. In Saipan, Callahan watched another platoon, armed with Garands, advance through the smoke. "They fight different now," he murmured. "Faster. Smarter." A nearby lieutenant nodded. "Confident cell, do that." He looked down at a fallen soldier's rifle, mud-smeared but functional, and picked it up reverently. "You can feel it? This thing changes how men move." Callahan nodded, his expression unreadable. "Because they believe it won't let them down. In war, faith takes strange forms, and sometimes it wears wood and steel." As 1945 approached, the rifle had become more than legend. It was a symbol of American resolve. Across every front, soldiers swore by its reliability. In France, Italy, Okinawa, the Mon's song was the same. Torres stood at the edge of a captured town, rifle in hand, watching civilians emerge from hiding. Dole approached, his voice soft for once. "Looks like it's almost over." Torres nodded. "Feels strange, like the rifle's quieter now." Reeves joined them. His sleeves rolled, hands trembling slightly. "Maybe she's tired too." Callahan stepped forward, dust-covered and proud. "Let her rest when you do," he said. The wind carried the sound of distant artillery, faint, fading, and for the first time in years, they let themselves believe in silence. The guns fell silent across Europe. In the ruins of a French village, the dawn broke pale and fragile. Private Eli Torres sat on the edge of a shattered wall, his M1 Garand across his knees, staring at a sky that finally held no smoke. Sergeant Dole stood nearby, cigarette trembling slightly in his hand. "Feels wrong, doesn't it?" he said quietly. Torres nodded. "Too quiet." Doc Reeves walked past with a bandaged soldier, his expression calm but hollowed out by months of war. Callahan arrived moments later, his boots crunching softly over rubble. "We made it," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The men looked at one another, worn, scarred, but breathing. For the first time in years, the sound of peace was louder than the rifle that had carried them through it. Weeks later, the men prepared to return home. The ships waited at the docks, silent giants of steel, carrying the weight of every memory. Torres stood with his rifle one last time, tracing his thumb over the serial number. "You think they'll let us keep them?" he asked. Dole shook his head. "No, but they'll remember." Reeves smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting the glint of morning light on metal. "So will she." Callahan, standing near the gangway, gave a slow nod to his men. "You earned your peace. Don't waste it." As they boarded, Torres looked back toward the horizon, toward Europe, toward ghosts, toward a rifle that had never failed him. He whispered, "Thank you, not to the weapon, but to what it had given him, the will to live." Back home in Massachusetts, John Garand sat alone in his small workshop at Springfield Armory. The war was over, but echoes of it lived in every letter sent by soldiers who owed their lives to his design. He held one now. A note from a private who simply wrote, "Your rifle never failed me, sir." Garand folded the paper carefully, setting it beside his drafting tools. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, peaceful yet tinged with ghosts. He ran a hand along the cold barrel of an early prototype, tracing its edges like an old friend. "You did what I couldn't," he whispered. "You came home." The silence that followed was the kind of quiet only history can keep. Months later, Garand was invited to a ceremony. Quiet, simple, but meaningful. Rows of soldiers stood in formation as he approached the podium, uneasy in his suit. Callahan was there, now promoted, nodding respectfully. Dolan and Reeves stood behind him, Torres at attention beside them, all of them older in ways time couldn't measure. "This rifle," Garand began, holding up an M1, "was built not for glory, but for men. Men who carried it farther than I ever could." His voice wavered slightly. "You gave it life." The audience of veterans stood in silence, eyes glistening. The applause that followed was soft but eternal, not for a man, but for the bond between invention and sacrifice. Years later, in a quiet veteran cemetery, the sound of wind replaced the sound of war. Torres, now older, walked slowly along the rows of white stones, his hands clasped behind his back. In one hand he carried a folded flag, in the other a photo of his old squad, Dole, Reeves, Callahan, all smiling in another lifetime. He stopped before a small museum plaque dedicated to the U.S. Rifle, Cap 31. The inscription read, "The greatest battle implement ever devised." Torres smiled softly. "You were more than that," he murmured. "You were part of us." As he turned to leave, the sunlight glinted off the glass display case, catching the reflection of a man and a rifle. Two survivors of history, bound forever by purpose.